Welcome, everyone, to What the Force. I'm Marie Claire Gould, your host, and with me today is a special guest to talk all about her book, One with the Force, 18 Universal Truths in Star Wars. Welcome, Krista, or should I say, Dr. Krista Noble.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
You reached out to me about this book, and I'm so happy that you did, because this is a great opportunity to introduce another lens to my audience about a different way of looking at Star Wars that has a basis in many of both the sacred traditions as well as sacred stories and philosophical background that is present across the world. And I am very excited to have this episode released on its release day, November 19th, so that everyone, of course, once they hear this episode, if they didn't already know about this book, can also pick it up and read it, because I have had the opportunity to read it. And it aligns so well with how I like to explore Star Wars and dig into both what our overall personal connection with Star Wars, but also this sort of more meta connection with how we view our own lives and our own experiences as humans. So let's dig into this. You wrote a book about Star Wars and sort of sacred traditions. So what's your story? What is your personal connection with Star Wars?
Well, I watched it when I was a kid, the original trilogy, and I was amazed by it. I was fascinated by it. That was in the context of, I grew up in a family of meditators. So my parents meditated, I meditated, my sister meditated, and we would just discuss philosophy all the time growing up around the dinner table. It was just normal. We just lived and breathed it. And particularly, we went deeply into Indian philosophy, Eastern philosophy, and all that, which, as we'll get to a little later in the talk, has a lot of very deep parallels in the Star Wars universe. So through that lens, through that exposure, I had a sense of some very deep spiritual themes in the Star Wars universe, in addition to appreciating just the storyline and the adventure and the excitement and all that. I ended up getting my master's, my PhD in Vedic studies, which has to do with knowledge from the ancient Vedic tradition of India, and has a very deep spiritual, very universal focus to it. But that ended up dovetailing very nicely with my interest in Star Wars. And I realized, a great way of sharing this more academic knowledge that I love with people, making it engaging and familiar to them, is to use a medium that they already know and love of Star Wars, and to really dig deeply into these movies and to some of the deeper themes that you can find there.
That's awesome. And it's exactly what I've done too, which is like taken a bit of my own, engagement with things that I've been interested in throughout my both university as well as my life, and then engaged with it through as a lens to which we can view Star Wars. So the Vedic traditions, oh my gosh, I pronounced that wrong, didn't I?
It's close. Vedic.
Vedic. They are primarily in India from a development perspective. Did you want to talk a little bit about them, just to introduce the audience to what exactly these are, and then we can dig into some of the interesting things that I found about the book and how it relates to both the mythic parallels as well as some of the things that I normally talk about on the podcast?
Absolutely. So first of all, I'll just mention that George Lucas, he's talked about the idea of the Force and how he came up with that. And he had a very universal perspective in mind. So he thought that this was really the essence of all religions, this idea of the Force. He was trying to come up with some idea that encapsulated this core of many, many religions. But as part of that, he definitely was influenced by Eastern traditions and Eastern philosophies, including the Vedic tradition. So just to talk a little bit about the Vedic tradition, and I deal with that a lot in the first part of my book. The second half broadens the spectrum to just religions and philosophies from throughout the world. But to delve a little more into the Vedic tradition, which I discussed a lot in the first part, this tradition, it stems from the Vedas. So those are ancient Indian texts, and they include the Upanishads. The Upanishads discuss topics like yoga, meditation, enlightenment, the nature of life. So some very deep, principles and concepts that continue to influence our perspective, even in the West today. They've influenced a lot of Western thinkers, transcendentalist authors like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, also individuals like Carl Jung, Hermann Hesse, Aldous Huxley, and many others, as well as non-Western figures who are also quite famous to us, like Mohandas Gandhi. He was very much influenced by these Vedic texts like the Upanishads and some subsequent texts that grew out of them, like the Bhagavad Gita. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so the Vedic tradition in general and these texts, they have a very universal perspective on life, meaning that they say that there are core universal truths that show up across all times and all locations and all cultures, just these universal principles that permeate every aspect of life, no matter what culture you're from, no matter your background. And so the oldest of the Vedas, called the Rig Veda, it says reality is one, the wise speak of it in different ways, meaning that the ultimate reality of life is the same no matter what time, what location, what culture. We just use different terminology to describe it.
Like the sort of world egg being that we're all part of it, or the idea of the Force, that everything is part of the Force and you are just, you know, a little piece of it, and that you're all connected and interconnected in and out.
Yeah, it's exactly that sort of thing. So this idea of the Force itself, you know, there are very strong parallels across the world and many, many traditions to this idea of the Force. And that's really what George Lucas was trying to tap into.
Yeah. And you absolutely dig into that in like the second half of the book, how universal the universal truths that you have found within the Vedic traditions and Star Wars are, which is so interesting to read about.
Oh, thank you.
So you looked at this because you became very familiar with it through your education and then also through teaching. And you said, oh, there's something in this that is universal in Star Wars.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, especially when you go through scene by scene and just really dig into it, you start to realize, okay, it's more than just some reference to the Force here or there. Like these themes are just throughout this whole story and in so many key events of the story. So I think it can give a deeper appreciation for the films, even for people who already are really passionate about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes Star Wars gets this like reputation of being religious for some people, or it is actually considered to be the largest mythopoeia of our times. And so I think that part of why it's successful is much of what I talk about, which is that it's plugging into very deep psychological motifs, archetypes, symbolism that is another language by which humans speak. But it's also familiar to us because it does replicate much of our sacred stories and philosophical traditions in how we like to think about the world.
Absolutely.
So I loved that you pointed out the blind man and the elephant story in your book because I've actually heard George talk about this. So it's great that you like pointed it out. You also called to many of the things I've talked about in my podcast, how the Force began, things like that. But it's very much from this sacred tradition lens, which dug in way deeper than I've ever had an opportunity to do. I really do want to encourage people, if you haven't been convinced by this point, do pick up Krista's book today because it will be great. But could you talk through the blind man and the elephant?
Gladly. I was actually hoping you would bring that up because it's such a useful analogy. Yeah. So for those who may not have heard it, the analogy of the blind man and the elephant is a bunch of blind men, come across an elephant and they want to know what it's like. But they can't see it. And so they reach out and they touch different parts of it. And one reaches out and touches its ear and says, oh, okay, an elephant is kind of like a fan. It's like thin and kind of like a flap. And another one touches its trunk and says, oh, no, an elephant is like a hose. Clearly, you know, it's long, kind of like a tube. And another one touches its leg and says, no, an elephant is like a tree trunk. So they're having completely different experiences of the elephant and coming to completely different conclusions about it, but they're all seeing one angle on the truth. They're all seeing one correct aspect of the elephant. And so this analogy has been applied to religions and philosophies of the world, that they see different parts of the elephant. And George Lucas had very much had that perspective as well, that, you can get very concerned about defending the trunk aspect of the elephant and forget about the ear aspect. But there is an ultimate truth behind all those differences. There is an elephant that all of these different traditions, all of these different blind men are pointing at.
Yeah. And what I love about this is that it's very much how I talk about Star Wars on this podcast, which is that you can take on these different lenses to talk about it, and you can shift your perspective to these different lenses. And if you're more open to that, especially exploring something that you're maybe not familiar with, you might find actually out more truth about what you are seeing in Star Wars and what you are drawn to about the story and about the experience of, working with it in your own psyche, that you could get if you just are only viewing Star Wars as its ears or its trunk or its tail or its feet or its body, right? So if you explore kind of the different aspects of Star Wars and the different lenses that can come. So I come very much from a psychological mythic motif, symbolism perspective, but exploring it from a religious lens, from a philosophical lens, also is quite useful. And I've done that a couple of times on my podcast to give a different sense of an angle or an experience. And so if we're talking about the elephant that is Star Wars and also lenses to our human experience, what is the most important thing that we get out of the lens that you're bringing to us?
As in, what specific insight maybe could my book provide on Star Wars? Or I just make sure I understand the question.
What is the most important thing that people are going to get out of your book or your words or your perspective? Because oftentimes I call out that when we have a heavy reaction to something inside of Star Wars, it's often because we need that lens to look at ourselves psychologically, and it's a mirror or a reflection of something that we needed to experience internally to grow or change or transform. So that's the perspective that I often talk about in my podcast. But what is the thing that when they look at it with your lens, they're going to get out of this?
Great question. I would say that the reason people resonate so deeply with Star Wars, the reason that it's so incredibly popular, is that it does contain universal truths of life. It's that it does contain truths about our human nature, about our connectedness to all things, about the ultimate unity of life. It's touching on these very, very deep principles, and it's enlivening them in us. And that's why we feel so drawn to it.
Absolutely.
And so my book really wants to bring out that universal perspective, and also to emphasize some of the principles that go along with that, like just the idea of life being profoundly purposeful, of our actions mattering, of there being a purpose to fulfill here on this earth, and us wanting to do our best at that, and a purpose that aligns with our own individual nature, our own abilities. Dharma is the Vedic word, which people will encounter if they read my book. But, very similar themes we find in Star Wars. Luke Skywalker finding his place in the universe. He was raised by farmers, and that was not his dharma, his calling at all. And so anyway, they're just the very deep themes about the evolution of life, the nature of life, the purpose of life that are embedded in this story. And when we look at it through the lens of some of the traditions that inspired it, we can unearth those principles, and we can even apply them to our own lives. So ultimately, I'd say that the wisdom of the Jedi doesn't just apply in a galaxy far, far away. It's actually deeply relevant to everyday living.
And so it helps to give you not only something to take away from the story, to maybe give you a new lens as well to your own life.
Yeah.
As you were exploring the book, what is the thing that was the hardest to deal with, to think about?
Oh, goodness. Probably just how to present different religious traditions in a way that everybody would feel comfortable with. And, because religion can be a contentious subject for people. And so I think, keeping the emphasis on these universal truths, I think that really helped. But at the same time, making sure each religion is given due respect, but at the same time, not giving anyone the sense that I'm trying to shove them into this religion or that religion, because the whole perspective is very universal ultimately.
Yes, absolutely. I think that what I loved the most about your book was it did come from a particular lens from your own education as well as like what you teach, and sort of opens up the world to say this is an old tradition. This is very old. The traditions that we're talking about are very old and ancient, and yes, we're influenced in Star Wars, but it's also talking, and then you open up the lens to say, okay, but we see these replicated in other traditions, etc. And it really does give you a sense that when we talk about humanistic stories like Star Wars, when they do align to something that is more universal, we will pick it up and like it more as humans. All right, so let's talk about the Force. This podcast is called What the Force. Let's talk about the Force. The Force, you have talked in a great amount of detail too, much like the Brahman is a universal consciousness. Do you want to expand a little bit on that?
Sure. So as Star Wars fans know, the Force is this all-pervading thing, and it's also beyond the senses. It's not something you can smell or taste or touch, but it's just all-pervading. It's everywhere. And that has parallels in many different religious and philosophical traditions. One of the deepest ones I found was with this concept of Brahman. That is a Vedic term, and it refers to universal consciousness, or a level of consciousness that underlies and pervades the entire universe. So from a Vedic perspective, we all have our individual minds, and then underlying those is a universal consciousness, a universal awareness and intelligence. So it's kind of like that universal awareness and intelligence is like an ocean, and our individual minds are like waves on the surface of the ocean. So ultimately, we're all the same essence. We're all the same water. We're all that same thing. But we're just individualized and in smaller doses as these waves on the ocean. So anyway, this idea of Brahman, this all-pervading consciousness, it lines up very nicely with the idea of the Force. It's something that's everywhere, but you can't taste it, you can't touch it, you can't smell it. The Vedic tradition emphasizes meditation as a means of experiencing it. And we do, in fact, see the Jedi meditating in various scenes. So even there's a parallel. But yeah, even this concept of something beyond the senses, we see that in some very key scenes in the original trilogy. Like when Luke Skywalker destroys the Death Star, he does so by closing his eyes and turning off his computerized targeting device and going inward. And in that allows him to have this intuitive sense of when to release his torpedo and blow up that Death Star. And so it's kind of a similar idea with the emphasis put in the Vedic tradition on meditation, on going within, on going beyond the senses, on transcending to a very quiet level of the mind, that level of universal consciousness. So both Star Wars and the Vedic tradition talk about an all-pervading level of reality that's beyond the senses, but that you can tap into through various techniques and even use to achieve your goals in life.
There's one of my favorite Star Wars authors is Ken Liu, and he wrote The Legends of Luke Skywalker, which is actually like a middle grade novel. And it's not actually like a novel so much as a frame story with little short stories about sometimes oft ridiculous Luke Skywalker stories, which are all made up. And one of the stories that he talks about is actually one called The Tide, which is they describe the Force as a tide, as like the ocean, and that the ups and downs are kind of like our experiences of going through like and being in the Force. And sometimes you're in a high, sometimes you're in a low, but as long as you are with the tide, you are flowing with it. It's really interesting to hear different people who are influenced, of course, by their own perspective and their own experiences, like bring in their own traditions into Star Wars as well. And then it still ends up being universal.
Yeah, definitely. From a Vedic standpoint, and I think this very much applies to Star Wars as well, there's a grand purpose of life, but then there's also individual purpose, and that has everything to do with a person's unique gifts, their unique abilities, what brings them love, what brings them joy, all those things. And so, it's that universal perspective is channeled through very individual experiences. Oh, and I just wanted to... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, that individual purpose that very much aligns with how Joseph Campbell talks about his own, how do you know your way on your own journey is you follow your bliss. And George Lucas actually has been quoted on talking about how he views it as seeking your joy. And it's one of the things I absolutely love about George is that like he internalized a lot of the things that he was interested in and then would sort of express them out in a way that has gone through his own thinking about the world and his own perspective to give us a version of his truths. But they still tie to these universal truths.
Exactly. And I just had to mention, because you brought up this water analogy again, there's actually another related analogy that I use in my book of a river, that a river is flowing towards an ocean. And you can see that ocean as the ultimate purpose of life, ultimate fulfillment, reaching your full potential as a human being. And so from a Vedic standpoint, it's the nature of life to keep carrying you toward that goal, to keep pulling you in the river towards that goal. But then again, as human beings, we have free will, so we can paddle with the current or against it. We can strive to become the best versions of ourselves, or we can do very much the opposite. Anyway, this idea of evolution and how we see that play out in the Star Wars universe as we watch characters grow to reach their full potential and actualize that, it parallels very nicely with the Vedic tradition.
I often refer to it as wholeness, like the being your whole self. The goal is to actually be truthful to who you actually are, and being to your full potential is very much in align with that. I do find it interesting, though, that in Star Wars, the easy path is not necessarily the flow to your whole self. The easy path is the flow to the darkness, to be greedy, to be selfish, to do the things that maybe wouldn't align with the analogy of the river flowing towards the ocean, at least in Star Wars.
Sure. In that case, I think we could expand on the analogy a little bit to put that there are a lot of little snags along the way, because we do live in the relative world. It's imperfect. It's not. But at the same time, from a Vedic standpoint, the ultimate perspective, not in every small bit, but there's some overall trajectory in that direction. But we can absolutely resist it and get caught in snags along the way.
Yeah. And it's because we do, like you said, live in the real world, and it's easy for people to get caught up in their own moment, in their own experience, and get lost in necessarily what is truth. And along that lines, you talk a lot about intuition, and I've talked a lot about intuition as the true compass to how we move towards our wholeness and our true version of ourselves. And intuition seems really important because it is, at least in the book that you've talked about, sort of speaking to a universal truth.
Definitely. Yeah, and I'll just say, for starters, you probably covered this on your podcast already, but there are a lot of scenes in Star Wars that seem to highlight this concept of intuition, like just the phrase, search your feelings, or even the phrase, I have a bad feeling about this. This topic comes up where characters are surmising things not on an intellectual, logical level, but just on a very deep, intuitive level. And same thing when Leia senses that Luke is her brother. So these themes absolutely come up in the movies. And yeah, from the Vedic standpoint and from the standpoint of many different religious philosophical traditions, intuition is a very deep level of the mind. And as we grow, as we evolve, we can tap into that more and more. And, or in early stages of our evolution, it can be easily confused with emotions. Following your intuition isn't the same thing as just doing whatever you want all the time. But as we grow, as we evolve, as we become more discerning and clearer, we can hear that sometimes they call it like a quiet voice inside. It's something pulling us in a particular direction, just saying, no, I think we should take this route and not that route. And it's a very powerful tool when you can tap into that.
Yeah, in and on an author that I often talk about, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, talks about intuition as Vasilisa's doll in the Vasilisa the Wise story, in that the doll that she carries around with her, which was given to her by her mother who passed away. It's a Cinderella story. Actually tells her to do maybe not necessarily what her fears would say, but what is right for her. You know, do the work or head down the path towards the witch, even though it's scary, because the doll represents her intuition. So it's really interesting to me to see how these things not only pop up in these universal truths, these ideas that are almost very archetypical and core to our understanding of the human experience, pop up not only in sacred stories and in traditions and in philosophies, but also just in the folklore that we align to understand our own experiences.
Definitely. I mean, another example, of course, would be Luke sensing that his father still had good in him. You know, I think that was a deep intuitive thing where he's like, it's exactly the sort of thing where it led him toward danger, not away from it. But at the same time, he sensed on a very deep level, that's actually what I need to do, even though everybody else is telling me this guy is beyond all hope, you know, just save yourself. And so anyway.
Yeah. And it's also like, what I love about that, the end moments in Return of the Jedi, is how it applies back to the idea of us all being interconnected, and that when you fully have compassion to what is opposite to yourself, then you understand that the world is larger than just you, and that you need to love all of it, even your evil father. And it's like, it's the balance between attachment being greed and attachment meaning compassion for others. And oftentimes the only time that we learn compassion for others to start when we're young is the love of our parents, the love of another. And then once you can see that in another person, you can love something in another person, especially somebody who you're so different from, you can find love for everybody.
Yeah. And then, you know, Yoda says, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. So that also kind of dovetails with Eastern traditions, this idea that ultimately our essence is a very good essence. That doesn't always mean it expresses itself in that way. And so, you know, ultimately Darth Vader has that level of goodness to him, but it's very, very buried by that point.
Yeah. But it's about him finding that compassion for like who he could have become. Like in that moment, Luke looks at his own hand, sees it's a robotic hand, looks at Vader's hand, sees it's a robotic hand, and sees that to truthfully love himself, he must also love his father, because his father was in a situation that was very similar to him and had ended up in that way. And loving yourself is loving the universe, because you are one with the universe. It's great stuff. Like that's great. And when you dig into the mythological motifs, and you dig in long enough into Joseph Campbell and how he talks about comparative mythology, it is the same thing that we end up seeing, in that when you experience apotheosis, the idea that you are not separate from the universe in the deepest, darkest part of yourself, then that's when you actually become whole for the first time. And then you leave the underworld and you go off and live your life. And then you come back when you need to experience apotheosis again. But it's those moments that we see. And those are all driven by intuition, love, connection to the universal consciousness, like understanding that we, like you said, are on our own journey and our own path. But fundamentally, we find ourselves back into the bigger universe.
No, absolutely. I mean, that has a lot of parallels with Vedic teachings, the idea of unity consciousness, of this awareness of the unity, the underlying unity of all things, and, you know, operating from that level and how that would affect your life when you can reach that level.
It's so cool. I love it. It's great. I did want to talk about opposites and balance. This is one of the things that I'm absolutely passionate about because it is quite a hard thing for many Star Wars fans to wrap their heads around. They view things very much in black and white, like because the story is framed in that way to tell you things are good or bad, but actually they are both, and that's hard. What is your perspective of opposites?
That's a really interesting question. And what comes to mind is in The Last Jedi when Rey is having the conversation with the older Luke Skywalker, and he asks her to close her eyes and to experience everything that's around her. And she talks about these pairs of opposites, warmth and cold, life and death, violence and peace. And they even show an image when she says life and death, they show for the life part, grass growing and various types of animals and stuff. And then for the death part, they show the skeleton of an animal underneath the ground decaying. But one of the points that comes out in that scene in her discussion with Luke is that both creative and destructive forces are necessary for evolution. Because she even says death and decay that feeds new life. So there is this cyclical element to it and that dovetails very nicely with Vedic teachings, which say that in order to create a new state, the old state has to be destroyed. So there is this sort of complementarity between creation and destruction. You can think of that in terms of suppose you want to build a beautiful house, but there's this really beaten up old house there in the way. So you've got to get rid of that old house. You got to bulldoze it before you can build the beautiful new house. So creation and destruction, they can both play a part in the evolutionary process. And it really becomes problematic when the destructive force completely overshadows the creative force. That's when things get really out of hand. That's when a lot of suffering happens. But in a proper balance between the two, they can both help with the evolutionary process that is inherent to life.
Yep. And also, it has to know that, George himself never viewed anyone as 100% evil. Even Emperor Palpatine, who is considered to be the devil of Star Wars, had good in him. And so I find it fascinating when Star Wars plays with that idea, in one of the Star Wars Lego shows where Rey goes back in time to the Death Star. Palpatine is thrown off the Death Star. It's Lego, right? So it's the show, but he's thrown off the Death Star, and he has this moment. He's like, maybe I was wrong all along. Oh my gosh, maybe I should, change. And then he still blows up. But he had a redemptive moment in that. And it's the idea that we ourselves are never beyond good and evil. We are somewhere always in the middle, right? It's this journey towards, which way are we facing? Or what are we most experiencing? It much like the river analogy that you gave just earlier. It's are we getting stuck? Are we trying to go opposite the stream of the flow of flowing with the universe or flowing with our own personal journey? Or are we fighting against it? And I often talk about, Joseph Campbell talks about how heroes will go to the underworld to experience their trials and to really experience death, because understanding that death is part of life is part of the union of opposites that we need to experience. But I often joke about how villains are just stuck in the underworld. They're stagnant. They have chosen not to understand that death is part of life. And so they've chosen to not die spiritually and be reborn.
Yeah, and I think stagnant is the perfect word for it. They're not evolving anymore. They got stuck in a place they're not supposed to get stuck.
And symbolically, Vader is almost like a walking coffin.
No, you could say that. He's not really making much progress anymore. He's just kind of really, really immersed in that evil.
Sealed, from a symbolic perspective. He's sealed in his coffin, and he's dead in some ways. And he just hasn't. He only through sort of the rebirth that he experiences with Luke and coming out of the coffin is he able to actually grow and change and ascend when he does.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, as you know, many spiritual traditions refer to like a spiritual death, but that is being part of your spiritual growth and dying, the lesser self dying and some higher self rising out of that. So that lines up very nicely with what you're saying.
Yeah, and that's much how like Joseph Campbell will talk about what you experience when you go to the underworld in a hero's journey or even a heroine's journey when you face the dark goddess within yourself. You will basically come to terms with life and death and understand that you must die to be reborn. Estes talks about how it is a life, death, life cycle psychologically, and that we all experience life, death, life throughout our lives, but we fight it because death is considered to be this very negative thing in our lives. And along those lines, you have a lot to say about death.
Yeah, it's a really interesting subject. Because, as you say, in modern society, we tend to see death in very negative terms. Even if someone's lived a long and fulfilling life, it's still just a very tragic thing for us when they die. And that's completely understandable. But it is kind of inspiring to look at the Jedi and their view of death, which is it's a natural part of life. Yoda says, twilight is upon me and soon night must fall. That is the way of things, the way of the Force. So the Jedi, they don't resist death. They take it as part of the natural ebb and flow of things. And then the funny thing is they're the ones who actually learn how to gain individual immortality. They're the ones who develop Force spirits and stuff. But they're not attached to this, to physical life, to living, forever, anything like that. On the other hand, the Sith pursue life at all costs. They're willing to compromise pretty much all their values in the pursuit of just this physical life. And they don't end up achieving the same reward that the Jedi do of these Force spirits that can come back and influence the world and stuff. So it is quite interesting that it's like the Jedi actually attain immortality, but it's not because that was their number one goal. They pursued things that were really important and ended up gaining that sort of as a byproduct.
Yeah, I really love that aspect of Star Wars, but I've also struggled with the with it as even in the Acolyte, it's even paired as something that is fully not understood even by the Jedi. Like the idea that loss of people, like you still have to mourn that loss of that experience, but you cannot be greedy to hang on to it. And so like I like the more complex storytelling that we've gotten in the Disney era, because it does challenge some of the assumptions around that perhaps the prequel Jedi and even Yoda were necessarily not 100% correct with the human experience. But it is still important to not be greedy to the things that happen in our universe, like in our experience, right? Like we can't hang on to people beyond, you have to be able to let people go. You have to be able to let things flow, even though you haven't necessarily, you want more, right? But you have to find a way to let go. And that's the difference between the Jedi and the Sith, like you said. I just think that Star Wars is more complicated than a lot of people give it credit for. And so when you have these discussions about, well, maybe the Jedi aren't right all the time because Luke proves them wrong by caring for the person that he was told nobody should care about. And so when you challenge these things and have these discussions with these different lenses, sometimes it's a little bit hard for some people to understand or to get behind, because there have been traditions across the world where there is value in asking these questions so that you can navigate it yourself and not just accept it as something that just works for you. You have to work with it to understand it and question things.
Absolutely. And they're complex topics for sure. I mean, certainly with regards to mourning the death of a loved one, I think that's a perfectly natural process that everyone needs to go through. I think some of the point that George Lucas and some of the other writers, as well as certain philosophical traditions, may be trying to bring out is just the clinging aspect. Yeah. Not so much that it isn't sad to lose something that you love, but so much trying to hold on even when it's no longer meant to be. that clinging to things that are impermanent, unfortunately, results in a lot of suffering.
It does.
But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like it's just like, I'm just reminded of The Acolyte and how like Jackie as the character is like, no, you should be happy for things that go into the forest. And it's like, well, wait, maybe we should be sad for a second and then understand this perspective. It just, The Acolyte was a quite complex show. And I think that it deserved a lot more love than maybe it got on the internet.
Sure.
Yeah. So redemption, I mean, this is more common in Eastern as a topic. Redemption is more common in Eastern traditions than necessarily in, I would say, a Western culture perspective. Redemption is achievable in most sacred traditions. It's not rare, but I would say when you get a specific lens of maybe North American focused individuals who are anti-redemption, even though they claim to subscribe to Christianity, you get a lot of commentary on people on the internet who especially don't understand that redemption is fundamental to existing as a human. We always have to have hope for ourselves. So what is your perspective of redemption in Star Wars?
I think it's a great theme in Star Wars. I think it's one of the main reasons that the original trilogy and, well, really the subsequent trilogies, one of the main reasons they resonate so much with people. It is tremendously inspiring to see somebody who is in a very, very dark place and to actually have the ability to lift themselves out of that. Most people have not committed atrocities like Darth Vader, but at the same time, we've made mistakes, we've made regret some things that have happened in our lives, and it's just very inspiring to realize, in a sense, it doesn't matter because we can still move forward, we can still evolve, we can still reach our full potential.
Like a lot of people will be like, "Oh no, like Darth Vader shouldn't have been redeemed; he should have been punished." And it's very hard to have one-to-one conversations about, well, humanity. We always need the opportunity to come back from the darkest places of ourselves. And also that is very fundamental to how George thought about the world and his own perspective of human experience.
Definitely. And I would also say that characters like Darth Vader are in a very dark state of awareness. Like what I'm trying to say, they're very unhappy. They're actually suffering very deeply. So it's sort of like an instant punishment in that regard that when they act in that way, he loses the love of his life. He loses all of his friends. He loses his mentor. He turns his back on all of that. Mm-hmm. I don't think he's happy lonely at all. He's very lonely.
He's alone. He's depressed. Oftentimes, the dark side is used as an analogy for depression, or for even I've seen it used for many people. They experience they watch Star Wars and they see the dark side as even addiction or being separated from loved ones because of personal choices, and like that's where that stagnant feel of the dark side. But redemption is finding your way back to others, to the connection to others, and then also finding your way back, your internal own path.
Yes, fulfilling your own purpose, and his purpose was to bring balance to the Force, and it wasn't until the very last minute that he did that, but he finally did it. So,
and what does balance look like for you?
Well, I guess it would go back to that sense of the evolution of life and how for things to evolve, you need the creative and the destructive forces to work in a somewhat harmonious way. Another analogy that I mentioned in my book is a forest fire. Sometimes forest fires, obviously, when they get totally out of hand and it's because of poor management or whatever, that's a problem. But in nature, sometimes forest fires have a very positive impact of clearing out old underbrush and stuff and allowing room for new growth. So in that way, it's this balance that allows life to evolve. Whenever life becomes stagnant in any way, whether it's because the brush has grown up too much and it needs to be cut back to allow for new life, or in the opposite direction, there's too much destruction, too much fire, and all the life is withering away. Either of those extremes, then life can't evolve properly anymore. So you need this balance between these opposing forces so that life can continue to evolve.
Yep. And internally, we experience that balance as well. We go through phases of death and destruction in our own lives. And in so many ways on our own personal journeys, we have to understand that it's part of a larger flow, right? And so that we can understand that we can be maybe more patient with those experiences of us not being in the right place at the right time, and work on the little things that we need to do to get us back to what is our joy, what is our personal path, where are we going?
Absolutely. Yeah. Personally, at times when I feel agitated in my life, anxious, whatever, I could see those as negative emotions, but most of the time I realize that it's because I need to shift something. When I shift something in my life, it's like, okay, this is feeling more comfortable now. But it's like that transition point, that change point, it can be very uncomfortable. And so, it's not like negative emotions are a bad thing. Sometimes they're just a little hint that you need to shift something.
Yeah, they're telling you that things aren't quite in alignment, etc. And when you accept that negative emotion is not necessarily the end of the world, and you don't fight it, or you don't try to hang on to it, or you don't ruminate in it or become stagnant in it, that's when you can sort of flow more easily back to your river, to the sea.
Exactly.
Wow, that's awesome. I love this. This is so good. The other thing that I had just as kind of like our wrap-up question here to kind of talk about the book and the journey to writing it. What was something that you discovered when you were writing it about yourself?
Good question. Goodness. I mean, so many things. I mean, the things that first come to mind have to do with the subject matter itself, just looking at the scenes a little more deeply, maybe understanding the movies a little more deeply. Mm-hmm. But yeah, about myself, I guess I'd say, I guess it's been a journey of finding the best way to convey deep principles, what I think are deep principles, to people, but in a way that they can really connect to also, to, on the one hand, not make it so intellectual that people might be lost or lose interest or anything like that. But on the other hand, the other end of the spectrum, not lose the depth or the richness that is there and that you can unearth. So kind of learning where to find that balance, how to connect, how to share these ideas with a general audience.
Yeah, so that it definitely becomes more interesting for them to explore things that maybe is really, really outside of something that they've grown up with. And then also that it gives you something out of it. You finish out the book by actually outlining the 18 universal truths that are in Star Wars. What is, I mean, they're all important, but what is one that you want to leave this audience with, and why?
Oh gosh, a couple come to mind. So let me quickly make a decision.
Or any of them. You can talk about the most important ones if you want to.
Okay, well, I'll say some of the key ones. I think some of the key ones are some of the first few. The first one is, and for those who haven't read the book, I say it both in Star Wars terms and then in more general religious or philosophical terms so that you can see it from either angle. But the first one is that there is an all-pervading force, or from religious philosophical terms, there is some sort of underlying reality to all of life. And this principle comes up in many, many different religious and philosophical traditions. And the next one is that unified reality that is within you, it's within the Jedi. So it can be contacted through meditation, through prayer for those who follow paths that involve prayer. But there are ways to connect with this underlying reality of life and to incorporate it into your life and to act more in alignment, more in the flow of that river to reach your full potential, to help life reach its full purpose, its full potential. Mm-hmm. So those are some big ones that come up. And yeah, just this subject of the purposefulness of life. Another one, the Star Wars version, I just quoted Obi-Wan. He said there's no such thing as luck. And that's very deeply aligned with a lot of philosophical views that everything is ultimately purposeful again. And so it's just a matter of aligning our actions in the best way with that purpose so that we can achieve our own fulfillment and the fulfillment of those around us. So yeah, I guess I'm kind of grabbing from a number of them, but they're laid out one by one in the book, but these are some of the broader themes that I would love to bring home to people.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I really, really appreciated about the book itself is that it walks you very thoughtfully through your perspective, the lens by which you're giving the audience or the reader the lens. It knows its history. It talks about like the Force and like where it comes from George Lucas perspective, and then digs into this lens and gives you all of the bits and walks you through the experience of why you've come to this sort of, I would say, thesis of Star Wars, of these universal truths. And I learned a lot reading it myself. And I read a lot of different stories as well as traditions, but this was a rare one for me, and also very valuable to have in my back pocket as far as the understanding of the more Eastern traditions as a lens to Star Wars. So
thank you so much. Oh no, I'm delighted that you enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I'm really passionate about these subjects, so nothing is more rewarding to me than being able to share them.
Is there anything that you want to leave my readers with as far as like what they can look forward to about the book or anything else?
Oh goodness. I don't know. I think the book it tried to strike a pretty good balance between fun exploration of Star Wars themes and characters and stories and all that, and also some of these deeper principles. So I think it's both fun but also hopefully educational, but not in a dry academic sense, but educational. Like these are principles that you can actually apply to your life and that you can see in other movies you watch, in your interactions with other people, in so many areas of life.
So sometimes I recommend books and they're very hard to get into. This is not that. It is very approachable. It is very rootable. It gives you all of the layers of understanding that you need to understand this particular lens that Krista's coming to. So I do recommend this book. It's great. And I think that any listener who listens to What the Force, if they're looking for something that explores these ideas from, a more religious, philosophical lens rather than mythic, psychological, symbolic lens, this is the first place I'm going to send people, because it really does frame it in such a wonderfully passionate way, but also gives you a lot of the background, and the bibliography is great as a place to start if you're looking for more things to dig into on top of that. So Krista, thank you so much for coming on the show. The book is, of course, One with the Force, 18 Universal Truths in Star Wars. If they're looking for you or for anything else that you do online, in addition to this book, which I was for pre-order when we're recording this, but I'm sure is available today, where can they find you?
Absolutely. So my website is just kristanoble.com. That's KRISTANOBLE.com. And my book is available on Amazon in both hardcover and Kindle versions. So if you prefer Kindle, that's fine. But it's also from other major booksellers like Barnes & Noble and Bookshop and others like that. But you can find all those links on my website, or you can just look it up on Amazon if you're interested.
Awesome. And I highly do recommend it. So check it out. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to What the Force. I'm Marie-Claire Gould, your host. Our music is orchestral music by Christy Carew for What the Force. You can support the show directly on Patreon at patreon.com/whattheforce. We would like to thank all our patrons, especially those who love What the Force: Sophie H., Scott, Derek C., Minky Moo, Sarah Joy, John, In Wild Space, How Rude, Neil, Christian Luca, Carly Ann, and Scott C. Support the show by wearing the Force with our merch, like and subscribe on YouTube, or leave a 5-star review on iTunes or any other pod app. It helps people find the show. You can connect with us on Twitter at WT Force Show, What the Force Podcast on Facebook. Our website is whattheforce.ca, or the Discord. Links are in the liner notes. Feel free to reach out and start a conversation. Cheers.